Welcome to The Explainer. If you're living in a commune or a collective, you've probably hit that wall where it feels weirdly tough to totally shake off those old top-down boss and worker dynamics, right? Well, today we're unpacking some source material based on Murray Bookchin's work that hits the nail on the head regarding this exact struggle. We're going to look at how our very perception of reality is shaped by the systems around us, and more importantly, how the text suggests we can radically shift that perception. Okay, let's dive into this. The absolute bedrock of our analysis today, straight from the text, is a pretty bold claim. Ecological crises and social hierarchy are essentially a package deal. Bookchin argues that whether we're talking about capitalism, patriarchy, or just rigid technocratic management, they all basically speak the exact same language of ranking and control. The source suggests that the very idea that we can dominate the Earth springs directly from systems where humans dominate other humans. So here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll quickly cover the hierarchical trap, look at why reality is not a binary, contrast chains versus cycles, situate humanity inside the web, examine hierarchy in everyday life, and wrap up with choosing an organic sensibility. All right, Section 1, the hierarchical mental trap. The source text makes a really fascinating point here. It argues that massive systems like capitalism aren't just physical institutions out there in the world. They actively construct our baseline psychology. They create a social reality that actually gives birth to a specific, dominant way of thinking. The text calls this the hierarchical mentality. Basically, it's a way of thinking that takes our incredibly complex, messy reality and shoves it into rigid little boxes. And it doesn't just separate things, it ranks them, literally labeling things as inferior or superior. The text refers to this as instrumental rationality, which is really just a fancy way of saying we start treating living things purely as tools. Think about a community garden for a second. Instead of seeing it as a vibrant ecosystem that we're an active part of, this hierarchical mindset just looks at it and sees caloric output. It totally reduces the totality of nature down to isolated units of production. Moving on to Section 2, reality is not a binary. So what actually happens when we try to force the natural world into these simple black and white categories? Well, the source material points out that by ignoring the gray areas, we accidentally create the perfect excuse for rationalizing domination. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The text looks at the simple progression of a day. Day and night aren't these strictly binary opposites locked in some epic battle for supremacy. They flow naturally, right? Dawn, twilight, dusk, evening. Their differences create a beautiful spectrum. They don't rank a hierarchy. Nobody's arguing that 2 p.m. is inherently superior to 9 p.m. The differences define the cycle. They absolutely don't create a boss. Which brings us right to Section 3, food chains versus food cycles. Transitioning over to ecology, the text presents this fascinating tale of two realities. It's about looking at the exact same natural phenomena, but interpreting it in two completely different ways. On one side, you've got the classic food chain. The text suggests that a hierarchical mind basically projects human monarchies onto nature, building this vertical pyramid. It dramatizes predator and prey relations as this grand struggle for supremacy, using terms like alpha male or king of the beasts. But organic sensibility counters this with the food cycle. In this view, there are absolutely no higher or lower ranks. Think about the compost system you might use in your collective's farm. It's an unbroken web of reciprocal nourishment. The text calls this metabolic continuity. The sheep nourishes the tiger eventually dies and nourishes the soil grows the plants, and the plants feed the sheep again. It's a loop, not a ladder. Let's shift gears to Section 4, humanity inside the web. So where do we actually fit into this giant cycle? The source text directly challenges that old anthropocentric arrogance, the idea that human reason somehow places us above the rest of nature. Here, the text introduces the concept of unity in diversity. If you look at a thriving forest, it's a total web of mutual contribution. It's the microorganisms, the incredibly varied plant species, the specific soil conditions, the animal life, all just doing their thing together. The big takeaway from the source here is that diversity is not a ladder you're supposed to climb to the top of. It's a web. And that web of mutual, unranked contribution is exactly what creates resilience. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the text frames human intelligence. When we see crows using tiny tools, or beavers actively damming and reshaping waterways, or whales singing across entire oceans, the text argues we are witnessing subjectivity in nature. Human rationality isn't some weird alien intrusion into a totally passive world. According to Bookchin, we are simply nature rendered self-conscious. We're an emergent potential of evolution, absolutely not the masters or the parasites of it. All right, on to Section 5, Hierarchy in Everyday Life. How does this deep philosophical framework actually play out in the micro level of our daily routines and our communities?
So, the crucial point is how this mindset shapes our actual social structures. The text argues that a hierarchical mentality naturally concentrates decision making. You get leaders commanding followers. But in organic community, the source points out that it relies on councils, assemblies, and affinity groups deliberating collectively. If you're involved in a commune or a mutual aid network, the text essentially explains why a consensus meeting feels so fundamentally different from a corporate boardroom. It's all about replacing a structure of command with a structure of complementarity.
And the text notes that we see this pop up in education, too. Hierarchical education is pretty much an authority figure dictating facts to passive students, just another flavor of command and obedience. But organic education, it's much more like a Skillshare workshop at your local community center. The source presents it as a dialogue where teachers and students co-create understanding together. It's about shared inquiry, completely avoiding that superior-inferior dynamic, and recognizing that true well-being is holistic and relational.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, Choosing an Organic Sensibility. The text makes it very clear, picking between these two mentalities isn't just some aesthetic, lifestyle choice for how we view the world. It frames it as a literal, existential necessity. The solution presented by the source material is to actively cultivate what it calls an organic sensibility. For a community built on mutual aid, this means recognizing that true ecological balance and social equality aren't just pie-in-the-sky utopian dreams. The text argues they are the actual, tangible, structural outcomes of getting rid of hierarchies. In this view, freedom doesn't mean being totally isolated and independent. It means actively participating in a richly differentiated, interconnected whole.
To wrap things up, I want to leave you with a really provocative question drawn directly from Bookchin's challenge. Can we dissolve hierarchy in our own thought to build communities that are genuinely free and sustainable? The source suggests the modern task isn't just about dismantling physical institutions out there in the world, it's about uprooting that deeply embedded hierarchical mentality from our own language and everyday perception. Take some time to reflect on how you might shift from a mindset of ranking to a mindset of reciprocity in your own collective. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep building that web.